Hello, my name is Henry DeCamp, and this is my final presentation for Education 101 at Victoria University of Wellington. The topic of this presentation is Pacific Education, placing cultural knowledge in a modern curriculum. I hope you enjoy it. In order to formulate a culturally sensitive approach to 21st century Pacific education, we should begin by considering the features of traditional indigenous education in these island communities. Now, when I say indigenous education, I'm referring to the traditional system of learning in place prior to European contact. While the Western form of education has become increasingly dominant, aspects of indigenous education remain relevant to this day. In Chapter 11 of Educational Ideas from Oceania, Te Wariki Te Ero considers indigenous education in Kiribati, a small country comprised of 33 coral atolls. Like many of the Pacific Islands, Kiribati is a largely homogeneous society whose indigenous education and epistemology resembles those found on other islands in the Pacific. The features of indigenous education in Kiribati reflect important characteristics of their culture, including respect for elders, communitarianism, selective imparting of knowledge, and gender-based distribution of responsibilities. At its most basic level, indigenous education deals with survival skills such as land ownership, genealogy, weaving, house and canoe building, fishing and navigation, as well as knowledge that enhances the enjoyment of leisure and traditions such as poetry, oratory, and dancing. Even these most basic teachings, however, are selectively imparted depending on gender and specialization of various clans. Te Ero writes that, quote, teaching is predominantly a one-way verbal communication from the teacher to the learner. Hands-on learning is the norm, and children are taught from a very early age to listen and to accept unconditionally what adults tell them, end quote. The older members of the community are seen as the most knowledgeable and experienced and usually have the responsibility of teaching. Like most Pacific Islands, Kiribati epistemology recognizes knowledge as having originated from the gods and departed ancestors. The role of elders and teachers, then, is to carefully guard this knowledge and entrust it only with those who will understand it correctly and exercise similar discretion in selecting the next learners. Indigenous knowledge in Kiribati and other island communities is carefully transmitted for the sake of conformity, cultural continuity, and a unified community. The underlying challenges facing modern Pacific education arise from features of these communities including their traditions and systems of indigenous education. The westernization of education in the Pacific Islands has come a long way since its inception. At its outset, colonizers and missionaries sought to civilize these native people. Later, their aim was to teach basic skills in reading, writing, and arithmetic, and today it is aimed at preparing these people for professional lives in urban settings. This modern Pacific education, however, remains connected to its colonial origin and at odds with traditional indigenous education. In his paper Beyond Access and Participation: Challenges Facing Pacific Education, Kabini Sangha discusses this mismatch between modern education and traditional learning in the Pacific Islands. He refers to these conflicting entities as in-school, or IS, and out-of-school, or OS, education. Younger children occupy the IS world when they are in school, from 7 a.m. until 3 p.m. 5 days a week. During this time, Sangha writes, quote, their world is one of roll calls, uniforms, books, chalk, computers, sitting in rows, abstract learning, speaking English, and assimilating foreign values, end quote. The OS world, by contrast, exists outside this time at school. It is the more familiar world where they are surrounded by family, traditions, and their native language. Sangha says, quote, in this realm, relationships between people as opposed to the tasks or the clock determine how time is spent and how good use of it is measured, end quote. This OS world is still educational, but in a different way. Here the emphasis is placed upon learning skills and concepts needed for them to meaningfully participate in their local community. The IS world, then, is, quote, one of conflicting value systems, of cultural intrusion, of identity denial, of pretensions, and of compelling aspirations for things not theirs. The purpose of education in the IS domain is to pass examinations, the ultimate goal being to obtain a good-paying job in the city, end quote. When Pacific Island countries focus their attention primarily on IS education, they benefit from increased access to quality schools, greater participation in the global economy, and more frequent interaction with the outside world. However, primary attention on the IS world is detrimental to the OS experience. If OS education doesn't receive adequate attention and resources, the local cultures are at risk of decaying. On the flip side, if attention is given primarily to OS education and not to IS education, Pacific Island communities face, quote, cultural stagnation, self-imposed marginalization, and are imprisoned in their own communities of mind, end quote. The question we are left with is, how can Pacific Island communities maintain cultural continuity whilst encouraging abstract learning and global citizenship? The obvious answer is by balancing IS and OS education, but how can we even begin to do this when they seem to represent conflicting histories, ideologies, and objectives? In order to balance these two worlds, communities need to break down the socially constructed barriers that apparently separate them. Sanger writes, quote, philosophically, educationally, and organizationally, the IS socialization experience must reflect and be integrated with that of the OS. The IS curriculum must be embedded in, not foreign to the OS. Teaching and learning must obtain their theories and practices from the OS. As well, the IS must contribute towards the positive advancement of the OS. The entire relationship must be critically reflective and mutually purposeful in nature, end quote. Now this sounds like a good theoretical solution, but what are some specific ways it can be put into practice? Many Pacific educational leaders, including our own Kabini Sangha, have been turning theory into practice as part of the Rethinking Pacific Education Initiative for and by Pacific peoples, which began in 2001. In another paper titled Indigenous Pacific Emerging Educational Metaphors, Sangha discusses several educational metaphors being used on Pacific Islands which bridge the gap between their local cultures and modernized education. For example, in the Solomon Islands, the iora, or canoe, is a metaphor for the concept of leadership. The canoe is divided into three sections, front, middle, and back, each with their own group of paddlers. Within each group of paddlers, there are assigned hereditary roles, including lead paddlers. Pacific scholar Stanley Huma describes the iora leadership framework as, quote, a form of collaborative leadership where authority is shared amongst a team of leaders who head the family groupings which occupy the seats within the canoe, end quote. A school can be thought of as a canoe, with assigned seats and various corresponding roles, relationships, and expectations. In Kiribati, the IS and OS worlds are being balanced as part of the Kiribati 2010 National Framework for Climate Change and Climate Change Adaptation. The framework combines scientific knowledge about climate change with local cultural values. For example, the Kiribati values of blessings, peace, and prosperity, combined with knowledge about climate change, make for environmentally responsible citizens. In conclusion, it is clear that the IS and OS worlds in Pacific education do not need to be mutually exclusive or at odds with each other. We've seen solutions from Pacific Island communities that have been used to bridge this gap. However, there is still plenty of work to be done. We should continue to explore new ways to educate Pacific youth so that they are connected to their past and prepared for the future.